Lightning flashed across the dark Manhattan sky as raindrops trickled down the huge windows of the majestic Plaza Hotel's event hall. Inside, the guests were immersed in a universe of luxury, hushed conversations, clinking crystal goblets, and an air of sophistication that seemed almost oppressive. But none of these details mattered to Nicholas Harrington. In front of the hall mirror, Nicholas was adjusting his tie for the fourth time, a gesture that was as automatic as it was pointless. His breathing was short, a symptom of what he would never admit: nervousness. The contract with Victor DeLuca was crucial to the expansion of his dealership network, a project he had been planning for years. But Victor was a demanding man, obsessed with stability. He wanted to do business with someone who, like him, had a balance in his personal life. A lonely-looking businessman didn't inspire confidence, so Nicholas needed a bride, if only for one night. He looked at Emily Dawson, the young receptionist who had accepted the unlikely deal. Emily was standing next to him, clearly uncomfortable in the rented dress that seemed to belong more to the salon than to her. Working as a receptionist at one of the Harrington Motors dealerships, she struggled to support her sick mother and teenage brother. When Harrington approached her with the unusual proposition, a generous payment in exchange for a few hours as his fiancée, she was reluctant, but eventually accepted. The money could change her life, even if only temporarily. She would be able to pay her rent arrears, buy her mother's medication, and pay off her hospital debts. Her hair was neatly tied up, and the discreet necklace around her neck was the only accessory she owned. Despite her upright posture, Nicholas noticed that she was clenching her hands in nervousness. "Remember what we agreed," he whispered, his voice low but charged with tension. "Smile, agree to everything, and avoid unnecessary questions." Emily raised an eyebrow, her smile defiant. "Understood, Mr. Harrington. Just smile and nod, right? Like one of those dolls on a car dashboard." Nicholas took a deep breath, ignoring the sarcasm. He didn't have time to argue. At the moment, his only concern was to impress Victor DeLuca and save the contract that could secure his company's future. He straightened his shirt cuffs and led Emily into the main hall, where Victor was waiting for them. But the ballroom door opened, and the entrance of two new guests made Nicholas's heart stop. Veronica Kane. She was there, arm in arm with Victor. Her blood-red dress seemed like a warning cry in the sophisticated surroundings. Veronica, his ex-wife, the woman he had loved and lost 2 years ago, was now engaged to the man he needed to secure his future. She smiled, a smile as sweet as it was poisonous, as her eyes met his. Nicholas felt a knot tighten in his throat. Emily noticed Nicholas's sudden stiffness. "Is everything all right?" she asked, leaning slightly towards him. He only nodded, but his gaze was locked on Veronica. The woman he had sworn to forget was now part of a game he couldn't afford to lose. Nicholas and Emily approached Victor and Veronica. The Italian businessman was a man of imposing presence, with a deep voice that resonated through the room. He extended his hand to Nicholas with a calculated smile. "Nicholas, we've finally met in person. This is my fiancée, Veronica." Veronica held out her hand, but her eyes were fixed on Nicholas, assessing every micro-expression. When he greeted her, his voice was cold. "Nice to see you again, Veronica." She smiled, tilting her head. "I didn't know you were engaged, Nicholas. What a lovely surprise." Emily noticed the tense exchange and instinctively grabbed Nicholas's arm. He looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and discomfort, while Victor watched curiously. "And this is Emily Dawson," said Nicholas, introducing her, "my fiancée." Victor smiled. "Charming indeed. We both seem to have found happiness, don't we, Nicholas?" Veronica let out a low laugh. "Ah, Victor, Nicholas always had impeccable taste." The pinprick hung in the air like a knife, and Emily felt trapped in a game she didn't fully understand. When they sat down at the table, she whispered to Nicholas, "Is there a reason for this tension, or is it just my instinct?" Nicholas avoided answering directly. "Just stay professional. This will all be over soon." While the main courses were being served, Victor led the conversation with stories of his properties in Italy, his expanding business, and his plans for the future. Emily watched without saying a word, trying to decipher the man who seemed to be at the center of it all. Victor was charismatic, but there was something about him that inspired fear, as if every word was a calculated move. Veronica, on the other hand, was clearly taking the opportunity to provoke Nicholas. Her comments were subtle but cutting. "So, Nicholas, have you decided what the next step is for your company? I'm sure Emily is a great source of inspiration for you." Nicholas could barely disguise his discomfort. Emily, realizing that he wouldn't answer, decided to intervene. "Nicholas is a visionary man," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "He has a unique way of dealing with challenges, both at work and in his personal life." "Oh, I know that very well," Veronica retorted, her voice laced with irony. "He's always had creative solutions." Emily felt her blood boil. She knew her role was to be the perfect quiet bride, but something inside her rebelled against the way Veronica was manipulating the situation. She looked at Nicholas, waiting for him to react, but he seemed petrified. Finally, she couldn't help herself. "Victor, can I be honest?" Emily's voice broke the atmosphere of silent tension. Everyone turned to her. Nicholas widened his eyes, clearly alarmed, but Emily continued. "Nicholas is a brilliant man, but I believe his company needs a change. Working as a receptionist, I saw some things that he probably didn't realize. There are supervisors who bully employees, overtime is never paid, and the general culture is toxic." A dead silence fell over the table. Veronica seemed to be enjoying herself, while Victor watched with renewed interest. Nicholas, however, was paralyzed. He felt as if the world was collapsing around him. Victor leaned forward, folding his hands. "Is that true, Nicholas?" Nicholas tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He knew he couldn't deny it without investigating, and admitting it at that moment would be a disaster. Emily, realizing the impact of his words, felt a pang of regret, but also a strange satisfaction. She had finally said what no one else dared to say. After dinner, Nicholas and Emily barely exchanged words. He left her at home without even looking at her, his face a mask of tension. The next day, Nicholas Harrington watched New York City from his office in the penthouse of Harrington Tower. The flashing lights of the city seemed to mock his situation. He swirled a glass of whiskey in his hand, but hadn't had a drink. Last night's scene replayed in his mind like a nightmare. Emily, his impromptu fiancée, had unmasked the hidden problems in his own company in front of Victor De Luca and Veronica Kane. He exhaled, pressing his fingers against his temples. The anger wasn't just at the public humiliation, but at something deeper, the truth of what Emily had said. He had never been a close boss to his employees, blindly trusting middle managers to keep everything in order. Now he was discovering that his negligence was the root of a toxic culture that could destroy his reputation. The phone on the table vibrated, and Nicholas picked it up without looking. "Nicholas." The voice of the lawyer Paul Sloan was as dry as ever. "Bad news. De Luca has confirmed that he's cancelling the contract. He cited incompatibility of values as the reason." Nicholas clenched his fist. Incompatibility of values. Those words hurt more than he expected. "What about the press?" Nicholas asked, his voice colder than he had intended. "The situation has already leaked out. There are mentions of the incident in the tabloids. It seems that someone at the dinner heard about Emily's comments and passed them on to the journalists." Nicholas hung up without saying goodbye. He stood there, staring at the city, as his pride slowly crumbled. As much as he wanted to blame Emily, He knew he was more to blame. In the late afternoon, Nicholas went down to one of his dealerships in the Bronx, where he knew he would find Emily. The place was bustling as usual, but when he entered, an uncomfortable silence spread. Employees looked away or pretended to be busy. Emily was in the break room alone, drinking coffee from a disposable cup. When she saw him, she raised her eyebrows, clearly surprised. "I didn't expect to see you here, Mr. Harrington. If you're going to fire me, don't bother. I know how these things work." Her voice was firm but not hostile. Nicholas closed the door behind him, crossing his arms. He watched her for a moment, trying to decipher her. Emily seemed as calm as she had the night before, but he knew it was a facade. She was as uncomfortable as he was. "I didn't come here for that. I want to know why you did it," he asked, his voice more controlled than he expected. "You had a job, just one, and you decided to turn everything into a spectacle." Emily didn't back down. Instead, she put her glass on the table and stared back at him. "Because someone had to tell the truth." She shrugged, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You can blame me, but it wasn't my truth that destroyed the contract. It was your negligence." Nicholas felt the impact of her words like a punch. He opened his mouth to retort, but Emily continued, "You've never set foot here. You don't know what it's like. People work late, without pay. Supervisors shout at employees, and everyone is afraid to complain because they think they'll be fired." "I haven't said anything that isn't already obvious to anyone who lives it every day. It's not that simple." Nicholas ran a hand through his hair, trying to keep his composure. "I manage dozens of dealerships. I can't control every detail." "No, but you can hire decent people to manage them, or at least care enough to know what's going on." Silence fell between the two of them. Nicholas felt a mixture of anger and shame. He hated to admit it, but Emily was right. Finally, he took a deep breath. "I'm going to put this right." His voice was low but determined. "Not because of what happened yesterday, but because it's right. I'm going to investigate every manager, review every practice, and I want you to help me." Emily laughed, but there was no humor in her laughter. "You want me to help? After all this?" "Yes." Nicholas stepped forward. "You told the truth yesterday, and it cost me a contract. But it also opened my eyes. I need someone who knows what it's like to be on the other side, someone who isn't afraid to speak their mind." Emily stared at him, evaluating his words. Part of her wanted to turn him down immediately, but another part, the part that cared about her colleagues who were still working under abusive conditions, knew that this was an opportunity to make a difference. "I'll think about it." That's all she said before leaving the room. Over the next few days, Nicholas immersed himself in his work like never before. He visited other dealerships, spoke directly to the employees, and began to see the extent of the problems. Emily, true to her word, agreed to help, but made it clear that this didn't mean she trusted him. "This isn't about you, Mr. Harrington," she said during a meeting. "It's about the people you've ignored for so long." At the same time, Victor DeLuca began to move in unexpected ways. He kept in touch with Veronica, who seemed more interested in provoking Nicholas than in strengthening her relationship with Victor. During a chance meeting at a social event, Veronica approached Nicholas. "It looks like you're finally trying to make things right," she said with a sarcastic smile. "But isn't it too late?" "For you, maybe it is," Nicholas replied coldly. "But I'm not doing this for your approval." Veronica raised her eyebrows, surprised by the firmness of his answer. For the first time, Nicholas seemed immune to the emotional control she had exerted over him for years. While Nicholas dedicated himself to turning his company around, Victor seemed increasingly distant. A rumor began to circulate that Veronica was interfering in his business, but no one knew for sure why. What seemed like a simple game of manipulation was beginning to turn into something deeper. Emily, for her part, began to see a different side to Nicholas. Although she still considered him a distant man, she couldn't deny that he was making genuine efforts to right his wrongs. Gradually, what had begun as mistrust turned into respect, albeit reluctantly. The air in one of Harrington's dealerships in Brooklyn was heavy with tension. Nicholas Harrington walked through the place accompanied by Emily Dawson, who had agreed to help with the restructuring, although she continued to keep an emotional distance. Employees watched him as if he were a stranger, and in a way he was. Nicholas had never mixed with the entry-level workers, and his presence generated a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Emily, clipboard in hand, asked incisive questions. She talked to mechanics, salespeople, and even the cleaning staff. Nicholas followed her, listening in silence as each statement confirmed what she had said over dinner with Victor DeLuca. The supervisors threaten to cut commissions if we don't work overtime," said an older salesman, clutching a handkerchief in his hands, "and anyone who complains gets fired." Nicholas took a deep breath, fighting his shame. Emily recorded the information without sparing him any hard looks. "This is ending today," Nicholas finally said, his voice grave. "I'm going to make sure that no one else works under these conditions." The employees looked at him in disbelief. They weren't used to promises from above. Emily, however, saw something different in his eyes: sincerity. For the first time, it seemed that Nicholas was really committed. While Nicholas immersed himself in the work of revamping his company, Victor DeLuca and Veronica Kane remained a constant shadow in his life. Victor, who had initially seemed distant, began to show renewed interest in signing the contract he had cancelled. But there was a catch. He demanded a private meeting, and Veronica would be present. The invitation came in a cold and direct email. But the implicit message was clear. Victor was testing Nicholas. Would he be able to stand his ground in front of his ex-wife and the man who was about to become his rival? Emily found out about the invitation when she saw the email on Nicholas's desk. He stared at her with an exhausted look. "What do you think he wants?" Nicholas asked. Emily crossed her arms, leaning slightly against the table. "Victor doesn't need this contract. He's already made that clear. So why insist now? My bet. He wants to see how much you can take. And Veronica, she loves to manipulate situations. Then I shouldn't go." Nicholas tried to sound decisive, but his voice wavered. "It's not that simple." Emily sighed. "If you don't go, they'll win. But if you do go, you need to be prepared. Don't let it get to you no matter what." The strength in Emily's words gave Nicholas the determination he needed. He agreed to attend, but decided to take Emily as his date, not to pretend to be his fiancée again, but as an advisor and witness. He was in his office, reviewing confidential documents that his legal team had unearthed over the last few weeks. The material contained something he had never expected: evidence that Veronica Kane, his ex-wife, had embezzled millions of dollars from his company's finances while they were still married. Accounts in a tax haven, disguised transfers, and forged signatures showed a clear pattern of dishonesty. The discovery made his blood run cold. For years, Nicholas had blamed himself for the failure of his marriage to Veronica, but now he saw that she had used the relationship to secure her own fortune. She was more than a manipulator. She was a criminal. More than that, Nicholas realized that Victor DeLuca, his potential business partner, probably didn't know he was engaged to such a treacherous woman. He knew he had to act. But how? Unmasking Veronica would mean creating a dangerous enemy, but remaining silent would allow her to continue to act with impunity. Emily Dawson entered the office, watching him curiously. "You look like a man about to explode." "What's going on?" Nicholas hesitated, but handed her a copy of the dossier. Emily read the documents in silence, her eyes widening as the evidence piled up. "Is this real?" she asked, shocked. "It is real," Nicholas sighed. "She embezzled millions, and now she's engaged to Victor. He doesn't know what he's getting into." Emily closed the documents tightly. You can't let this go. He needs to know. What if he doesn't believe me? Nicholas crossed his arms, his tension evident. It seems obvious that I have a motive to defame you. It could turn against me. Emily faced him firmly. Then show him irrefutable proof. If you're honest, Victor will see who the real threat is here. And what's more, you'll expose the truth, no matter what the cost. Nicholas reflected for a moment. Emily was right. It wasn't just about business or pride. It was about justice. Dinner was arranged at an exclusive Manhattan restaurant. Nicholas arrived with Emily, both impeccably dressed but tense. At the back of the room, Victor and Veronica were waiting for them, sitting at a secluded table. The ambience was luxurious, but the atmosphere was charged. Veronica smiled when she saw them, but there was something in the glint in her eyes that Nicholas recognized. A game was being played, and she thought she was in control. Nicholas, Emily. Victor greeted them warmly. I hope this will be a productive evening. It certainly will be, Nicholas replied, his voice firmer than usual. As the dishes were served, Victor began to discuss the contract he had previously cancelled. He seemed interested in reconsidering, but Veronica often interrupted with subtle comments that diverted the focus to personal issues. You must be very grateful to have Emily by your side now, said Veronica, smiling. It seems she's more useful than I've ever been. Nicholas ignored the comment, but Emily didn't back down. I think the question here is not who was helpful, but who was honest. Her voice was sharp, but calm. Victor frowned, sensing the growing tension. What's going on here? He asked, looking from Nicholas to Veronica. Nicholas took a deep breath. It was time to act. Victor, there's something you need to know about Veronica. He placed an envelope on the table. These documents prove that while we were married, she embezzled millions from my company into accounts in tax havens. Veronica's face turned pale, but she quickly pulled herself together, laughing scornfully. That's ridiculous. Are you really going to believe him, Victor? He'd do anything to ruin my reputation. Victor opened the envelope and began leafing through the documents. His face hardened as he analyzed each page. Veronica's signatures, the bank records, and the transfers were overwhelming evidence. The silence that followed was deafening. Veronica. Victor finally spoke, his voice low but full of fury. Is this true? Of course not, she exclaimed, her mask of confidence beginning to crack. He faked the whole thing. You know what he's like, Victor. A desperate man. Emily intervened, placing a second envelope on the table. Here is the report from an independent expert. All the signatures and transactions have been verified. It's authentic. Victor read the second envelope, his expression becoming even darker. He stood up slowly, staring at Veronica. You used me. His voice was full of betrayal. And you still thought I'd be blind to it? Veronica tried to argue, but Victor silenced her with a gesture. He turned to Nicholas. It seems I underestimated your integrity, Nicholas. I was wrong about you. This contract will be signed. But first, I'm going to make sure that Veronica faces the consequences. Veronica stood up, but before she could leave, Victor called the restaurant's security guards. 2 burly men appeared, ready to escort her out. She cast one last, furious glance at Nicholas. It's not over yet. As Victor and the security guards led Veronica away, Nicholas sat down again, exhausted but relieved. Emily, standing next to him, put a hand on his shoulder. You did the right thing, she said softly. Nicholas looked at her, finally allowing himself to relax. I couldn't have done it without you. Emily smiled but didn't reply. They both knew that this was more than a business victory. It was a moment of transformation for Nicholas, a man who had faced his past and come out stronger. The clock in Nicholas Harrington's office ticked 10 p.m., but he hardly noticed the time passing. Surrounded by piles of reports and graphs, he was personally reviewing Harrington Motors' restructuring plans. The usually quiet room was filled with voices voicemails from managers, calls from partners, and occasionally the sound of his own conscience wondering if he was on the right track. Emily Dawson was next to her, sitting on a nearby sofa, tablet in hand and a critical eye fixed on the screen. The last few months had been the most challenging of their careers, but also the most revealing. The company was changing, and so was Nicholas. Here's the problem," said Emily, pointing to the financial report of one of the subsidiaries. "Sales are up, but the employee turnover rate is even higher. This indicates that working conditions are still not ideal." Nicholas rubbed his eyes, exhausted but attentive. "So let's start again. I want to know what these employees are saying, and if the local managers can't give us honest answers, fire them. We have no room for excuses." Emily smiled, slightly impressed. The man who had once ignored the details was now obsessed with them. "You really have changed." His voice was softer than usual. "And, I must admit, it's nice to work for someone who finally understands the importance of that." Nicholas looked at her, surprised by the admission. Emily rarely handed out compliments, and this made her words all the more meaningful. "I'm not just doing this for them, Emily." He held her gaze. "I'm doing this because I've realized that building something great is worthless if the people behind it are broken." Emily looked away for a moment, as if she needed to process the sincerity. There was something about Nicholas now that made him different, almost vulnerable. It was something she hadn't expected to see when she took on that unlikely job of pretending to be his fiancée months ago. Over the next few weeks, the changes implemented began to transform Harrington Motors from the inside out. Nicholas visited branches in person, often accompanied by Emily, to hear directly from employees. He asked incisive questions, but also showed genuine interest in their answers. On one visit to a branch in Queens, a young mechanic called Teresa approached Emily while Nicholas was talking to the managers. "Is it true that he's really listening?" Teresa asked, suspicious. "Or is this just to look good for the media?" Emily looked at Nicholas, who was leaning forward, listening intently to a technician explain the parts supply problems. "It's true," Emily replied. "It took him a while, but he's trying. And, honestly, it's more than most people would do." Teresa nodded, but still looked skeptical. It was something Emily understood well. Trusting someone like Nicholas, with his past of arrogance and negligence, wasn't easy. But she knew he was determined to prove himself worthy of that trust. While the company was showing signs of recovery, an internal audit revealed an even bigger problem. Fraudulent practices in several branches had siphoned off hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. The scheme involved trusted managers, including Thomas Bell, a close friend of Nicholas who had worked with him since the beginning of Harrington Motors. When Emily brought the information to Nicholas, he was silent for a long time. Thomas was more than a colleague. He was someone Nicholas trusted blindly. "He was with me from the beginning." Nicholas' voice was heavy. "I would never have gotten here without him." Emily looked at him with compassion, but didn't soften her words. "I understand, Nicholas, but that doesn't change what he did. He betrayed your trust and hurt hundreds of people in the process. You need to decide, are you going to protect him or do what's right?" Nicholas knew Emily was right, but making the decision was one of the hardest things he had ever done. He summoned Thomas to a private meeting and presented the evidence. "Why?" Nicholas asked, his voice breaking. "Why would you do that?" Thomas tried to justify his actions, claiming debts and external pressures, but Nicholas knew that nothing could erase the damage done. He stood up, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. "You don't work here anymore, and I'm going to make sure you're held accountable for it." The pain in his eyes was evident, but his voice didn't waver. Thomas left in silence, leaving Nicholas alone in his office. Emily entered shortly afterwards without saying anything. She just put a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that said more than words. While Nicholas dealt with the consequences of his decisions, his relationship with Emily continued to evolve. They started seeing each other outside of work, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. One evening, while they were discussing the next step for the company, the conversation took a more personal turn. "Do you regret agreeing to work with me?" Nicholas asked suddenly. Emily tilted her head, surprised by the question. "Sometimes," she replied with a playful smile. "But most of the time, no. I think you've surprised me. I never thought I'd have so much to teach a CEO." Nicholas laughed, but there was something in his expression that looked more serious. "You surprised me too, more than anyone I've ever met." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but charged with something that neither of them was ready to admit. Over time, the changes implemented began to show real results. Employee satisfaction rates rose, sales increased, and confidence in the market was restored. Victor De Luca, who was closely following the progress, sent Nicholas a message. "It looks like we've finally found the right partner. I'm looking forward to what's to come." Nicholas knew that this victory was not just his, but that of everyone who had worked to transform Harrington Motors. More than that, he knew that Emily's presence had been fundamental. Although there was still a lot of work to be done, Nicholas finally felt that he was in control, not just of his company, but of his life. He didn't know exactly what the future held for him and Emily, but for the first time he was willing to find out. "I appreciate you sharing this moment with us. Every story I tell is crafted with dedication and care, with a view to touching the hearts of those who listen. If this narrative has awakened something in you, please consider signing up so that we can continue together on this journey of telling stories that move. Your support is essential if we are to continue sharing these unique experiences. Cheers, and we'll see you in the next story.